thoughts for her next move, though the growing ache between her eyes was making that difficult. The street was eerily quiet. A low mist rolled in, nearly obscuring the road in a ghastly white veil. The sky was nearly black, and the clouds parted only long enough for stray beams of moonlight to touch the world below. Every window was dark, showing nothing within except a foggy reflection. An aura of yellow light came from the end of the street, practically right across from the courthouse. The 7-Eleven. Rose sighed and crept the Jeep up to 7th Street. As she drew nearer, the old convenience store with its repurposed 1930s brick architecture came into view. There were no gas pumps out front. If you wanted gas, you'd have to go a couple of streets over to the Shell station.
I should just go to Shell,
Rose thought, feeling her stomach tighten at the thought of entering this particular 7-Eleven. She remembered the building briefly before its repurposing in the early 2000s. The only time she had been in the building when it was a funeral home was at her grandfather's funeral. She had been 9. On the way to the bathroom, she had somehow made a wrong turn and found herself locked in the morgue. By the time her mother found her 30 minutes later, she was in the corner, shivering in fright, waiting for any of the corpses to rise. Then, she spotted Richie, 16 at the time, glancing from behind Mom and mockingly quivering. "Watch out, Rosie. All those guys from the funeral home are gonna follow you home," he had said for nearly a year after. "They're gonna come get you, and they want to be your boyfriend." At the time, Rose cried hysterically while Richie howled in laughter. It was that short time in the morgue and Richie's continuous mocking that made Rose weary of the building, even when it had been converted into a 7-Eleven. It was the reason why she had only been in the convenience store once since it opened. She had been in high school, and her friends wanted to grab snacks before heading back home. Rose only lasted a minute before she found an excuse to wait outside. Now, thinking of the incident made Rose's face hot. Any trepidation burned away. She snatched the phone from the passenger seat and parked in front of the 7-Eleven. The scent of rain lingered in the night, and the surrounding vapor made the air thick. Rose rounded on the storefront, her Nikes too loud on the quiet street. She caught a glimpse of her reflection and sighed. She hadn't had time to properly assemble a presentable outfit, so she wore a pair of old sweatpants and a large shirt she only reserved for exercising. Her auburn hair was matted and frizzy. Rose ran a quick hand through her unruly hair before grabbing the handle of the store's glass door. Trepidation flared within her once again, giving her pause. Her knuckles tensed against the door as though some force held her in place. "What's the matter, Rosie? Your boyfriend's waiting," Richie's voice echoed in her head. Rose grunted, pulled open the door, and walked inside. She squinted at the assaulting fluorescent light. The interior had changed drastically from its bygone days as a funeral home. The building had once been divided into several smaller rooms and viewing areas. Now it looked as though a majority of the walls had been torn down to create an open space. Several shelves of snacks and candies lined the store to her right, and a wall of refrigerators containing cold drinks lined the walls. To her left was a vacant counter and register. Rose took a few steps in, her wet shoes squeaking against the yellow linoleum.
Hello?
She called into the store, her own voice sharp against her ears. The store was eerily silent. Not even the usual radio played in the background. It was almost as if someone had left and forgot to lock up.
Hello?
She called again, taking a few more tentative steps inward. A rustling came from one of the shelves toward the rear of the store. A can of dog food rolled out from behind that particular shelf, where it came to rest several feet in front of Rose. Rose stared at it for a moment, as though it were a viper preparing to attack.
The clerk must be in trouble,
she thought, blaring in her mind like a neon sign. Rose darted forward, knocking the can aside with the stride of her hurried foot. She rounded the corner to find a man with his back to her, swaying slightly to and fro, with arms dangling at his sides. He wore the green shirt and tan pants typical of the 7-Eleven staff, and his bald head was oddly pasty in the lighting. At first, it looked as though some kind of distortion stood between her and the man, a blurriness. She blinked several times, and the blurriness was gone.
Excuse me.
Rose said. The cashier didn't turn. Rose took a step forward.
Do you need help?
She asked a little louder. The man raised his head. Rose took a breath of relief. At the very least, he was responding. He turned slowly, revealing a gaunt, pallor face. The man's eyes were so sunken that in the right light, it appeared as though they were missing. A deep gash became visible across his bald head, plastered with trails of dried blood across his face. The wound glistened in the fluorescent light, and Rose could have sworn she detected the white of bone. Rose's heart felt like a lump of meat in her chest.
It's one of the corpses from the basement.
She frantically thought as her body tensed to dash back toward the door. Before that primitive, childish line of thinking took root, she forced herself to remain rooted.
Oh my god, he is hurt.
The more sensible part of her brain realized.
Don't move.
She said, reaching for the phone in her pocket.
I'm going to get help.
It took her a couple of seconds for her trembling fingers to correctly punch in 911. She pressed the phone against her ear. Nothing.
Shit.
She muttered. Rose glanced up just as she caught the man disappearing around the corner at the opposite end of the shelf.
Sir?
She called out, her feet carrying her forward. Just as she rounded the shelf, a crashing noise made her jump. The man stood before one of the refrigerator doors and pounded his head against the glass. Upon the first strike, the gash upon his head split open, releasing a new barrage of blood across his face and the door. Fissures marred the glass with each strike, and crimson seeped within the cracks to form some macabre web within the door. Her joints froze in place. The man took no notice.
It was amazing
Rose commented on some distant part of her mind.
how the man's face didn't cave in.
Granted, it was nearly there. His face bent unnaturally to the side, and several teeth littered the ground around his feet. Yet he kept pounding, pounding, pounding until his head smashed through the glass. The man hung in the opening while blood and snot coated the interior of the door. Shards of glass, some as long as Rose's forearm, glistened upon the linoleum. Rose's head felt light, and she forced herself to take a deep breath. The lightness abated, but it did nothing to quell her racing heart.
Call 911.
She thought, even though she knew that the signal would be non-existent. Maybe there was a landline, yet she couldn't help but stand, transfixed upon the man whose head lolled within the broken opening of a refrigerator door. She was back in that basement again, surrounded by corpses draped in white cloth. The man slid his head out of the opening, making Rose jump. His momentum carried him away so far that he nearly fell backwards. The 7-Eleven employee hung there for a moment, their back bent in an unnatural curve. Then, as though he were a puppet being pulled up by the strings, he jumped to an upright position.
Run!
Not even the memory of Richard's childhood jest could overcome this singular demand. Everything that night, from the call to Richie's answering machine to the man's erratic behavior, had the hallmarks of a bad horror movie. And guess who the Scream Queen is? Richie's voice taunted her. The hairs on her arms and her neck stood on end. The man bent over, his body hanging so low he should have fallen on his face. His fingers searched the ground clumsily until it found purchase on a particularly long shard of glass. Blood seeped from the man's hand as his grip tightened, tinting the glass in thick crimson. With a jerk violent enough to make every bone in his spine crack, the man stood upright and made a long, exaggerated step toward Rose. His upper half lolled as if every bit of strength were in his legs. Rose felt his eyes lock onto her, but there was nothing in them. They were dark and cloudy, the eyes of a dead man. Rose's legs finally unlocked, and that thought replayed with renewed force.
Run!
She staggered for a moment when her feet tangled. Rose rightened herself and made for the door. She expected to hear hurried footfalls behind, but all she heard were her own frantic steps toward the entrance. Pain radiated through Rosie's shoulder as she shoved through the door with enough force to make it slam against the wall outside. The glass shuddered, but it didn't break. Rose cried out, but ambled to her silver trailblazer. She pulled on the handle only to find the mechanism unrelenting. Panic blurred her vision. Rose pulled feverishly once and twice more to the same result. The whole time, Richie was whispering in her ear the old line from a Romero movie. "They're coming to get you, Rosemary." It wasn't until she felt the shifting weight in her pocket that she realized she had locked it. She dug her hands into her pants, her frantic fingers playing around the cold metal of her keyring. Something banged behind her. Rose glanced over her shoulder. The man stood before the door, his figure slightly humped and silhouetted in the fluorescent light of the shop. His head was bowed as though he couldn't summon the strength to lift it, yet in a brief, flailing motion, the man raised the shard and struck the glass of the door. "They're coming to get you." Rose wrenched the keys out of her pockets. Her fingers felt stiff as they cycled through the keys. She shoved the key at the lock. It recoiled off, leaving a healthy groove in the paint. Something moved in her peripheral vision. Rose didn't look up, only focusing on the key and getting into the lock. The key slid in. Rose tried the handle and the door popped open. She had just crawled in, shut and locked the door behind her when the 7-Eleven's door burst open. The man tumbled into the misty night. Rose jammed the key into the ignition and turned. The engine turned over once before dying. A cold sweat dotted Rose's brow. She turned the key again. A half-hearted revving came from beneath the hood, but stopped just as quickly as it had begun. A shadow fell over her, followed by a... Against the driver's side window, almost as if by instinct, Rose turned toward the disturbance. The man from the 7-Eleven stood outside, the tip of the glass shard in his hand lazily gliding across her window. His head lolled as though his neck were broken. The blood from his forehead wound looked black in the dim light, and Rose could barely see his eyes within his sockets, though Rose was sure that he wasn't looking at her.
Because he's dead.
Her frantic mind protested. It was the thought that made her grasp and scramble across the seats so she could spill out the passenger door. Her shoulder struck the concrete, causing a spasm of pain radiating up her right side. As she stood, Rose noticed several other figures stumbling out of the storefronts and alleys. Some wore torn clothing, while others looked pressed and unblemished. Most possessed some kind of trauma. Stab wounds or head wounds were the most common, though Rose's stomach twisted when she noticed a woman in her 20s ambling toward her with a slit throat. Rose opened her mouth, though she wasn't sure what sound spilled out. She wasn't sure where she was going, giving her feet control to zigzag around the people.
Zombies.
She told herself.
They're fucking zombies.
And sprinted down the back streets and avenues long since etched into her subconscious. Some animal instinct pressed her on without any comprehension of her surroundings. Buildings and streetlights became blurs. Regardless of how fast she ran, it was as though the undead were always just a step or two behind. The night was dead silent, only amplifying her dragged steps across the road. Rose didn't dare look over her shoulder, didn't dare see how many were following. 10, 20? Hell, maybe even an army. Maybe they were swarming out of the graveyards and morgues just to chase her, yet she didn't look back. She couldn't make that nightmare a reality, or else her knees just might give out, and then what? When Rose came back to her senses enough to comprehend her surroundings, she found herself looking down a familiar-looking street. Even in the non-existent moonlight, she recognized the nearly identical one-story house and the neatly trimmed lawns. This was a street that she had ridden her bike down, had played out in the neighbors' lawns all day on a Saturday afternoon, or almost ran over a mailbox the first time she tried her hand at her mom's Malibu. As though to punctuate the point, Rose turned to come face to face with the same house she had lived in throughout her childhood. The house was blue, its windows dark and its driveway vacant. Had her mother sold it already? She said that she was going to, as her mother had long since moved into an assisted living community nearly across the state. But there was no for sale sign. Rose pushed the thought away and darted toward the front door. Her steps felt heavy, and it sounded as though the shuffling of zombies were growing louder and louder, closer and closer. Rose wrenched open the screen door, turned the handle. Locked. She tried it again as though it would somehow magically unlock itself. Rose shoved her hand into her pants once again, hoping that she still had the key to this place. Her face drained of color as she realized her pockets were empty.
Help!
She screamed, pounding on the door.
Help!
The strike sounded hollow against the wood. A shiver ran through her. Maybe that was the whole town. Hollow. Just one big corpse pretending to still be alive, waiting to attack. A shadow fell over her as the shuffling footsteps, what sounded like an army of footsteps, sounded as though they were directly behind her. The door opened, revealing a shadowy figure. Rose's breath caught in her throat as she reeled back. The figure grabbed her arm and pulled her inside. A scent of mildew and must assaulted her senses as soon as she crossed the threshold. Rose tumbled forward, expecting to feel that sliver of glass pierce her back. Instead, there was only the slamming of the door and then silence. "Rose?" a voice asked from the darkness. Rose squinted at the figure, her eyes slowly adjusting to the near darkness of the living room. A man nearing his 40s hovered her. His brown hair was kept at a messy, short crop, and the stubble on his face gave him a slightly haggard look. The man wore a white tank top and jeans, revealing the numerous cuts and bruises on his arms.
Richie?
Rosie asked, her brow furrowing. Richie barely acknowledged her, instead running to the window and peering out the curtains. A low rumble of thunder made Rose shudder.
Get it together.
She told herself, yet that logical part of her brain couldn't quiet her own hysteria.
They were dead. They had no color in their eyes. Just white like those bodies in the basement of Murdoch's.
"Rose?" Richie said, shaking her arms roughly. Rose winced. She opened and closed her mouth several times, yet all the questions she wanted to ask wanted to come out all at once. Then, Richie did something that made the words retreat even farther. He drew her into a tight embrace. In all of their 40 years, he had never done that. Smelling his musky aftershave made her want to vomit and pass out at once. "Jesus Christ, I can't believe you came." Rose finally wrenched away, eyeing Richie carefully. Something about him was off, though she couldn't tell what exactly.
What happened?
She finally whispered. Richie sighed as he released her and wandered back toward the living room's window. It wasn't until then that he noticed how bare the room was. The old couch she and Mom used to watch movies on, the old grandfather clock passed down from Rose's great aunt, the antique coffee table that her brother had bought for her mother's birthday.
The only real nice thing that Richie ever did for me.
Rose thought. They were all gone, leaving a shaggy gray carpet and the indentations where the furniture was supposed to be. It was as though it wasn't her house anymore. In all seriousness, it wasn't. It hadn't been Rose's home for a long time, or so she had thought. The memory of the home that was gone lingered in the back of her mind like a ghost. Sitting here in this hollowed-out husk left her with an empty feeling within her chest. "What happened?" Richie asked, grabbing a pack of cigarettes from his back pocket. He plucked one out, put it between his lips, and drew from it. Rose watched the ember glow as she waited for him to continue. After what felt like half an hour, Richie exhaled a cloud of gray smoke. "It was a few nights ago. I was down at Jack's having a beer. It was slow that night for some reason. I know you never cared for bars, but on Friday nights, it's usually rockin'. But something was off that night. I'm not sure what it was. Like the air was heavy and thick. It must have been what put people off. I just thought rain was on the way. About 9:30, Jimmy Mann comes running in, nearly scaring the shit out of us. 'They're coming,' was the only thing he'd say. 'They're coming out of the lake.' Mann was really losing his shit. Lou, the bartender over there, finally got a drink down him, and after a few minutes, got him calmed down enough to talk right." Richie took another long drag from his cigarette, the ember running down the length of it, nearly to the filter. He let out a long jet of gray smoke that seemed to linger there in the dark. Rose suppressed a cough.
Jesus.
She thought as she watched the feat.
How can you do that and not hack up a lung?
Richie placed the butt on the windowsill before turning back to his sister. He said he'd been night fishing out on Lover's Lake when there was this big bang and a flash of light. He couldn't see what it was as the light was coming from the middle of the lake and he was on the pier, though he thought he saw some big metal thing where the flash came from. Said it sank too quickly for him to get a picture. Then he said they came out of the lake. The room momentarily brightened as a bolt of lightning struck across the sky. Moments after, the pitter-patter of rain struck the roof.
You mean the zombies?
Rose asked, her voice small and shaking.
Is that what he meant? The zombies?
Richie's eyes furrowed. He bowed his head so the shadows played across his face. For a moment, his eyes were hidden in the darkness, reminding Rose of the man in the convenience store. Her chest tightened, and the tingling sensation of an oncoming panic attack numbed her fingertips. Richie stepped forward, and the image was broken, leaving Rose cold and trembling. "They're not zombies," Richie replied, his voice low, a similar voice he used when he was trying to scare her. Was he trying to do that now? However, the usual smirk that played across his face when he tried to do that was absent. Instead, he stepped forward, grabbed Rose by the arm, and pulled her up. Rose's body hung limp at first, from exhaustion or a mental break, she wasn't sure, and it took what little willpower she had left to remain upright. He held her, if a bit rough, to the window. "Look behind them," Richie whispered in her ear. "Watch the rain." Rose refused to look out. She couldn't bear to look out at those pale faces, their stiff movements, the way their heads lolled on their shoulders. Richie brought his hand under her chin and forced Rose's gaze to the window. A thin veil of rain distorted everything, reducing the walking corpses to blurry figures. The air behind them shimmered as though the rain hit and slid down something that couldn't be seen. The more Rose stared out into the rain, the clearer their forms became, or at least what the placement of the rain revealed. The outlines of humanoid creatures stood behind each corpse. They stood at least 10 feet tall, with bulbous, featureless heads bent down over the corpses they followed. If they did have any distinguishing features, Rose couldn't see them. It was like looking at glass. The area where the creature stood was distorted, but only betrayed an outline. Rose watched as the corpse of a young man stumbled forward a few steps, and the invisible creature held its long, thin arms over him. With every movement the young man took, the creature followed, as though it were a puppeteer and the corpse was a puppet. "Do you see them now?" Richie asked.
Yes.
Rose replied, her voice nearly a squeak.
What are they?
"I don't know," Richie replied. "We thought Jimmy had lost it when he told us. That was before corpses started getting back up in the morgues. Then the killing started. Bullets didn't stop them. Phones, cars, computers won't work right around them. We couldn't call for help. By the time everything was said and done, the streets were red with blood. Had it not been for the rain, they probably still would be." Rose chanced another look out the window. The rain slowed to a drizzle, so the giant's outlines became less defined.
Why do they need corpses?
She asked. Richie walked to her side, parting the curtain to look onto the street with her. He looked paler than she remembered.
Probably from everything that's happened.
Rose thought.
I bet I look like a ghost myself.
For the first time in forever, Rose felt sorry for him. "They can't touch anything that's not dead," Richie said. "They can't interact with most things on their own. I think they want to populate the world, but most of them can't get humans right. Most can't walk right, can't speak, can't emote. Not yet, anyway." Richie turned abruptly toward Rose, embracing her once again. The movement was so sudden that it nearly drove what little breath she still had in her lungs out. "I'm so glad you're here," he said. "We need to get out of here. Let people know."
We will.
Rose found herself saying. She raised her arms, where they hovered a moment before she wrapped them around him. It was a stiff hug, this being the first time she hugged him, really hugged him, and meant it. It wouldn't be so bad if his skin didn't feel like ice against hers. As Rose pulled away, her hands grazed the back of Richie's head. Something wet and sticky clung to her fingers. She brought her hand to the light to find a thick layer of blood coating it.
Richie?
Rose started, her eyes tight with confusion. When she looked into his eyes, she felt her skin grow cold. They were milky in the dim light, dead. Rose opened her mouth, but what came out was barely audible. Richie smirked, his pale skin stiff and cracked. "Are you scared, Rosemary?" The Mandela effect. That phrase never meant anything to me. Spooky, I guess, but it wasn't something I thought about for more than 5 minutes. I mean, honestly, until college, I didn't even know what it was. I'm not one for conspiracy theories or ghost stories or anything like that, so what would you expect? I wish I was still so ignorant. It all began in my life science class. I was 20 at the time, and it was pretty close to the end of the fall semester at FSU. My professor, Dr. Arnault, had given us our finals early because she had a heart and didn't want us to be studying for everything at once. She figured doing our finals before everybody else's gave us time to study hers without any distraction, and then gave us time to study everybody else's with a little less stress. I loved her for that, but part of me wishes she had never decided to bless us that way. On the last day of class, most people skipped. Everybody knew we weren't really doing anything, and everybody just wanted to be done for the semester. Still, some of us were bound by the attendance policies on our scholarships, and others, just out of courtesy to Dr. Arnault, showed up. I, personally, was present because I loved her class. 1 more hour and 15 minutes of her teaching was a win for me, and hell, I had nothing better to do. She began the class slightly differently than she usually did. We'd often start out with a current event from earlier in the week, something about GMOs, the dramatically declining population of giraffes, or something else relating to life science. But today, we looked at an older article, and something far from relative to biology. It was about the Mandela effect. I'd never heard of it before. Most of us hadn't, but she was passionate about it. The old lady was usually pretty sprightly while teaching, choleric when somebody disagreed with her, but man, today, she was ecstatic.
All right. To those of you considerate enough to show up to my class today, I have a treat for you. I'm going to teach you all about something that you'll probably never forget. Or maybe you'll blow it off, I don't know. But if this intrigues you like it did me, I'm sure you'll be happy you arrived. Can somebody tell me when Nelson Mandela died?
Everybody looked around confusingly. Then a girl raised her hand.
He died a couple years ago. 2012, I think.
She slowly nodded, studying the class like she was waiting for something. And she found that something.
Seagrave.
She pointed at a boy in the class.
Why the confused face?
I thought he died a while ago. The 90s or something? In prison? She beamed with delight.
Well, class. Is Amanda right? Or Cole?
Everybody seemed conflicted. Most of us were like me, and honestly had no clue, but a couple people agreed with Cole, and one other person agreed with Amanda.
Amanda.
Dr. Arnault commented.
You're closer to correct. He died from a respiratory tract infection on December 5th, 2015. But why did some of you think he died in prison in the early 90s then? Some of you thought that. Badar.
She motioned at one of the guys to explain.
Where'd you come to that conclusion?
I swear we learned that in 7th grade. In my world history class. It was part of Black History Month.
Yeah, same here.
One of the girls nodded.
Black History Month when I was a kid. He died, and then there was this thing about his wife trying to sue some company.
Exemplary.
Dr. Arnault was more complacent than I'd ever seen her.
You remember all this being said. Except, strangely enough, it never was. None of this was ever said. Look it up. Go to Google and search Nelson Mandela death. You'll find nothing about the 90s or a prison. For that matter, type in Nelson Mandela prison death. You won't find a CNN article or a documentary about his funeral, which was televised all over the globe. You won't find his purported cause of death, and you'll find nothing about the riots in South African cities afterward. Because none of it happened.
This left me a little weirded out. Most of the class was silent now and waiting for her to make sense of it.
It's a phenomenon known as the Mandela effect.
She grinned.
A complete mystery. An enigmatic anomaly on Earth with no scientific explanation.
And from that point, the hour and 15 minutes flew by. I thought 5 minutes had elapsed when it was time to be dismissed. It left me absolutely mind-boggled. Basically, it's the theory that Nelson Mandela did die in prison in the 90s, but then something happened that somehow reversed this event, and he went on to live decades longer before dying again in 2013. Though some of us don't remember Mandela dying in the 20th century, others do. They remember the news coverage, the papers, the heartfelt speech from his widow, but all of it vanished from the universe when this event took place and rewrote history, and all that's left is this huge collective memory. These people that know he died like this, and all remember that same thing somehow, but it's wrong. Personally, I don't remember being told Mandela died in the 90s, but a lot of people did, and do. There are two theories behind it. The first, and less common, is time travel. They say that someone went back in time and altered an event just slightly, but it created a ripple effect that resulted in something changing dramatically. Here's a made-up example. Bob married Sally. Bob and Sally met downtown sometime back in August of 2005. Bob's dog just got ran over, and he was grieving, and when he saw Sally walking her dog, he couldn't help but walk over and talk to her. Before long, they were in love and married. Well, then, Jack goes back in time to the same town around the same time. Jack's driving on the road about the same time Bob's dog got ran over. But since Jake's driving, and he's in front of the car that hit Bob's dog, since Jake was a better driver, he comes to a halt and never hits it. The dog runs back over to Bob completely fine. So now, when Bob goes downtown, he doesn't think twice when he sees Sally walking her dog, and they never say a word to each other. They each get married to somebody else, and now their son, who could have cured cancer or something, never exists. But time travel is believed to be entirely fictional and improbable. The more common theory is that there are several universes, all alternate, and that sometimes they rub shoulders, or essentially cross paths, like two cars in a really minor accident, a fender bender. Universe A rear-ends Universe B, and almost everything is the same, except Universe A needs a new bumper. Well, in literal terms, now something between Universe A and Universe B is swapped. Nelson Mandela lived to 2013, and died of a respiratory tract infection, and not in prison in the 90s. And now, everybody in Universe B thought he died from lung infection instead of in an African jail. This one's the commonly believed one. After Dr. Arnold's class, I looked more into it. There are other examples too. Take the Berenstain Bears, for example. We all read those books as kids, or at least our parents read them to us. Well, without looking, how is their name spelled? Berenstein, or Berenstain? Which one? If you said Berenstain, you're one of the thousands of others that would bet their house you're right. But you're wrong. It was never spelled that way. And what about Curious George? Did he have a tail? What position is the thinker making? Is his fist pressed against his head, or is his hand not even balled up, slumped onto his cheek, his fingers extending all the way to his chest? Curious George does not have a tail, and the thinker does the latter position. These things may seem silly, but if they're wrong, why do so many people believe them to be true? Personally, I have my own theory about the Berenstain Bears and Curious George. When you read the name Berenstain, it looks Jewish or German, and like many Jewish or German surnames, you think of it ending in Steen instead of Stain. Take, for instance, Goldstein, Perlstein, hell, Einstein. We all know that name. Berenstain just doesn't look right. Over time, our minds filled in the A with an E. Same with Curious George. He's a monkey, for God's sake. Of course, we think he had a tail. He's even commonly portrayed hanging from a vine, with his head down and his butt up in the air, as if he's hanging from his tail. These are more like the power of suggestion. Through external factors, our memories of these simple things were altered. But then you have the thinker, King Tut's burial mask, and Nelson Mandela, of course. If the thinker really is posing with his hand in a relaxed, non-curled, flat motion pressed against his cheek, which is folding over his knuckles, why do we remember his hand as completely balled up and resting against his head? And not just us, but popular cartoons depict it this way as well. Why do so many people make this mistake? In King Tut's burial mask, what is on top of the mask, right between his eyes? There's a figure depicted there, an animal, to be more specific. For those of you that thought, snake, duh, you're like me, but you're wrong. At least, partly. There's a snake and a bird that looks so outlandish and unnatural on that mask that I can't even look at it without shaking my head. There couldn't have been two animals. That looks ridiculous. Look it up on Google and see for yourself. I remember in 6th grade, I had a world history textbook with that burial mask on the cover. I looked at that thing every damn day. Hell, when I was nodding in class, that's where my eyes fell, down onto the cover of that book, which was sitting on my desk. I never saw that bird. I thought that maybe it could have just been the angle, but the bird sticks out so far that there's no way you can't see it, unless the mask was turned completely away from you, which it never is. And if it was, you wouldn't be able to see the snake either. I'm not the only one that remembers it looking like this. Popular cartoons draw it wrong all the time, too. But there was always a bird on that thing, since 1323 BC. Well, enough of my rambling. You might be wondering what all of this has to do with me. See, after Dr. Arnold's class that day, I couldn't get this off my mind. I was so spooked out by it, so morbidly intrigued that it just occupied my thoughts. I felt like a victim of it. But still, it wasn't some grand epiphany of mine, some life-changing philosophy. After all, I was too busy studying for exams to ponder it that often. But all that changed when I sat down with my friend Asher a week later for breakfast. Asher and I had been friends since 1st grade. We met at Tawas City Christian Academy in Michigan, in a town with a population of less than 10,000. It was always freezing there, dreary and gray and silent. You could see the whole town from a 5-story building. There were miles and miles of abandoned cornfields. The only real moneymaker in the town was a small harbor at which fishing occurred. I discovered later on that apparently in other countries, Tawas City, Michigan, is known as the bird-watching capital of the world. Purportedly, a vast array of bird species migrate there, and it's great for bird watching. I never noticed that. All I can remember is the snowy gray skies and the silent cornfields, and the feeling that if the place was wiped off the earth, no one would ever notice. Naturally, the public school was puny, but the private school, it hardly existed. In my class, there were 15 of us, 16 including the teacher. So I thought. I'm starving, man. Asher sighed, walking ahead of me into the diner. It was an early Saturday morning. It was the last week of the semester, and we'd been studying like crazy. We figured our day would be spent doing the same thing as usual, an amalgamation of studying endlessly and resisting the urge to buy Adderall, which was pretty prominent on the campus around that time. But my day didn't consist of that at all. We sat down at our usual booth, Asher's hair as red and messy as usual. He was a ginger, and a mischievous one at that. He was a prankster and barely passed his classes. He was there for the booze and girls, and his grades reflected that. But, as best friends do, I forced him to study and pass. Still, breakfast was a school-free zone. All mention of classes and tests went off limits at the diner. Here, we wanted to rid our minds of it all, The last time we met up, I went on and on about the Mandela effect, to the point he wanted to shove scissors in his ears. So I tried not to mention it today. I'm telling you, man, he sipped his coffee. When this is over, we're partying like crazy. Like crazy, Sean. I don't want to remember where I am when I wake up that morning. I chuckled. Yeah, man, for sure. Don't you sometimes wish we were back at Tawaz Christian? I mean, not back in the city, but just the classes. We thought they were so hard. We both laughed. God, we were wrong. Yeah, that was a whole different universe, bro. Shit was so easy compared to now. And there were only 14 of us in total, unless you include Miss Davis, which is fucking crazy. 14? I think it was 15, man. He looked confused. Nah, bro, it was 14. Me, you, Aaron, Glass, Tyler, Mahoney, Zach O'Toole, that quiet girl named Grayson, Elizabeth, Norman, that one kid, I don't remember his real name, but we all called him Taz. We called him Taz because he talked so fast nobody could hear what the fuck he was saying. I chuckled as I remembered him. There was Brian Reed, the twins, George and Jordan Reynolds, that one nerdy kid, Dylan, and then Miss Davis. That's 15, including her. And Eve? He squinted his eyes. Who? Eve, the shy girl, remember? Short, blonde, brown eyes, didn't talk to anybody. He shook his head. That was it, man. There were 14 of us. No, dude. I replied. There was Eve. I've been waiting for you to name her the whole time. He just looked at me like I was telling him bread was a liquid. Asher, are you messing with me? Stop, dude. I'm not messing with you. There just wasn't an Eve. I distinctly remember 14 of us. Remember? It's 4 girls, 10 guys. No? I shook my head. 5 girls, 10 guys. That's how it was. Her name was Eve. She didn't talk to anybody, and we both never said anything to her. You're messing with me, man, and it isn't funny. I started to feel panicked. I've been reading all this shit about the Mandela effect, and now you're trying to freak me out. Come on, man, stop. Now he looked frustrated. Stop with that Mandela shit. There's no Eve. You're sleep deprived. What? I was getting annoyed, but also terrified. All this hysteria I'd embraced lately, as I considered if the effect could be real, left me feeling hopelessly crazy as Asher argued with me. I knew there was an Eve. She went to Tawas Christian with us. Her face was easy for me to recreate in my mind. Sean. He looked at me intently. Are you fucking with me? No. I replied, trying not to sound panicked. It was such a simple situation. Asher just forgot about her. It was over a decade ago. She wasn't by any means a notable student. She shied away from conversation, sitting in the back of the room with nothing to say. She only talked when forced to by Miss Davis, and none of us struck up conversation with her. Bro, you're just forgetting about her. She was quiet, man, like really quiet. First grade was a long damn time ago. Maybe. He shrugged. Honestly, though, no, I can't be. I remember that class easily. There were 14 of us. You must be thinking about something else. Don't tell me I was thinking about something else. I felt hopeless. Man, this isn't funny. You know that Mandela shit has been freaking me out. Please, Asher, stop. I pleaded. He looked horrified. Sean, I'm not fucking with you. Why are you getting so worried, bro? Here. He slid me his coffee. Just relax, man. Relax. It's not a big deal. You're fine. She was there with us, Asher. Remember reading group? There were 5 of us in each group. Eve was in my group. No, man. I mean, you're right about there being 5 in each group, but Miss Davis was in a group, remember? No, she walked around and supervised. I argued. Asher, Eve was in my group. I know she was, because every time she was forced to read, she'd choke up and not say anything. And then the few times she did read, I was always enamored to actually be hearing her voice. Because I never did. Like, no one did. Asher was still silent. Both of us knew what we knew, but one of us was wrong, right? Dude, I begged. Her car, remember that at least? Her mom dressed nicely in a dress, always. She'd come pick up Eve in that fancy black car. I never gave a shit about cars, and I still don't. In my senior year of high school, I thought the Altima was a car make. I couldn't tell the difference between a Porsche and a Honda, but I remember her car because it was so nice looking. It was probably a Cadillac or something. Come on, man, we used to always think it looked cool when it came into the pickup loop. Her mom was first to arrive every day, and Eve would get up quickly from her lone corner on the bench and trudge over to the car, and her mom would come out, dressed nicely, even if it was snowing, and hug her. Every single time. She always smiled nice because her mom hugged her every morning, too, and got her perfume on her. Now Asher looked worried. Sean. He shook his head. I don't remember her. I'd say you're thinking of someone else from another school, but we've gone to the same school since first grade, and I don't remember her. Ever. Maybe it was someone you met in preschool. No, we both talked about her. She was in my reading circle in Miss Davis's class. What about afterward? You're only talking about first grade. I don't remember her after that. She must have moved. But she was in first grade. That's probably why you forgot her. She moved, and you just remember all of us that graduated 5th grade there. No, man, I remember first grade too. She wasn't there. Miss Davis was my favorite teacher. I remember that year easily. There wasn't a girl named Eve. I don't actually know why, but I felt like crying. Imagine that all your life, you never believed in ghosts. Then you see this horror movie or something, and there's a scene where the main character is looking in a mirror, and then the reflection stops following him and does its own thing, and it's horrifying. After that, you just keep thinking about that scene because it scared you so much. But hey, it's just a movie. It's not real, and that's the only thing keeping you from never looking into mirrors again. But then you figure out the movie's based on a true story. Okay, anybody could say that. It's based on a true story, like all horror movies. Just because it could be true doesn't mean it is. Nothing's hitting close to home. And then it happens to you. You get out of the shower, and you're drying off, and you happen to look into the mirror. You raise your towel to dry off your hair, but when your reflection comes into view, your arms are at its side, and it's staring at you. You're terrified. It's real. It's happened to you, and there's no denying it. That's how I felt at that table. Maybe it wasn't just concrete, but I knew Eve was in that class. I remembered her like the back of my hand, but Asher didn't. Not at all. It was like the bird on King Tut's burial mask, like the thinker's flimsy hand stretching the skin of his cheek, like the absent footage of Nelson Mandela's huge funeral in the early 90s. I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. For the rest of the day, I didn't study anything. I was too overwhelmed. I tried my hardest to assimilate Eve into a preschool memory, but she was incompatible. She didn't fit. She didn't fit at my old church. She didn't fit in my neighborhood growing up. She didn't fit anywhere but Miss Davis's first grade class. Finally, that night, I called my mother on the phone. At that point, I wasn't entirely convinced I was witnessing the Mandela effect. Some part of me figured that Asher had just smoked too much reefer in high school and forgot about her, and I knew how to find if I was right. I told my mom that she wouldn't hear much from me this week because of all the studying I'd be doing, which she totally respected, so she was pretty surprised when I called her.
Hey, Sean.
She sounded excited.
What's up?
Hey, Mom, I wanted to ask you something. Do you remember a girl named Eve in Miss Davis's class?
That's a random question.
She replied.
No, it doesn't ring a bell. On your 7th birthday, you invited over all the kids, but I don't remember an Eve.
Yeah, I invited her, but she didn't come. I remembered. She was really shy. That's probably why you forgot her.
Well, I have some pictures of you in the 1st grade. I could send them over to you, and you could point her out to me if you see her in them. Why are you asking anyway?
Well, Asher doesn't remember her either. It's just weirding me out a little bit. I chuckled, trying to hide my nervousness. Yeah, it'd be cool if you sent those pictures. Do you have ones of the whole class?
The one with all 14 of you?
The words left me severely uncomfortable. 15. There were 15 of us, Mom.
No, 14, I thought.
What the fuck? I whispered. Mom, yeah, just send the pictures if you can.
Okay. Is everything okay, Sean?
Just feeling weird. It's weird nobody remembers her.
I don't have the class picture.
She sighed.
I wish I did. Asher's mom might. See if Asher can get it from her, but I'll send you the ones I have.
Okay, thanks, Mom. We talked a bit longer after that, but my mind wasn't occupied by the conversation. All I could think about was Eve. I could remember her short body, her perfect posture, the quaint dress she wore to class. I could remember her scent that to this day still appeared sometimes in supermarkets or in a lecture hall for a fading second, just long enough to remind me of first grade. I could remember her voice when she finally worked up the courage to read in our reading circle. I could remember everything about her. I knew I'd be able to point her out if she showed up in any of the pictures. Still, what bothered me was this. The Mandela effect is a smooth criminal. It's articulate, pinpoint, exact. It leaves no trace behind. Here's what I mean. The thinker, for instance. A lot of people remember taking pictures with it. They know the thinker didn't look the way it does when they took the picture. So they go back and find their old vacation album, brushing the dust off and reluctantly finding them posing with their ex-wife before the statue. And all the work and awkwardness of thumbing through the old albums was for nothing, because in the picture, the thinker is doing exactly what they remember it was doing. Even weirder are the pictures that went viral of people standing right in front of the statue, posing with their fists against their head. They're in front of the damn thing. Don't they think they'd maybe notice it wasn't doing what they thought it was doing, and not posed incorrectly right in front of it? Or maybe they're not complete idiots, or just downright oblivious. Maybe when they took that picture there, it was pressing its fist against its skull, and then, when the Mandela effect occurred at some untraceable, inexact moment in time, the picture changed. But only the statue. It left everything else that wasn't the statue the same, resulting in the bizarre image of people posing incorrectly right in front of it. I knew that this was the Mandela effect I was dealing with. There'd be no point at all to receiving these pictures. Whether or not Eve was standing there when the picture was taken 15 years ago, she wouldn't show up in it. The only way to catch the Mandela effect is through relative things, like the people posing wrong in front of the statue. And if this wasn't relative, if the universe pulled Eve from existence, then she wouldn't be present in any of the Polaroids. But I wanted to check anyway. Maybe something would stand out. My mom sent 4 pictures. The first was of me, Asher, Brian, Reed, Taz, and Norman playing at aftercare one day in the mud. The second wasn't useful either, just me and Asher sitting at a picnic table one night at open house. The third picture, however, was interesting. It was of the Christmas concert. All 15 of us were taught 3 church songs to sing at the concert, and our parents came and watched. It was humiliating for all of us, except maybe Aaron, who was born to be a star, but it was especially embarrassing for Eve. This photo jogged my memory immediately, and what made it so strange was the formation of the girls. In the picture, you see all of us on stage. There is one riser on the stage, and some of us were standing on it, while the others were standing in front on the stage itself. On the left side are the boys, 5 in front and 5 on the riser. On the right are the girls, 3 in front and 1 on the riser. Between 2 of the girls, it looks like somebody is missing in the picture. You have Erin on the left, then Amy next to her, then Elizabeth next to her, then Grayson is standing on the riser between Erin and Amy. Eve would fit perfectly between Amy and Elizabeth. Perfectly. Why the hell would they put these 3 girls on stage and 1 girl alone on the riser asymmetrically? Especially when the boys are lined up perfectly. It makes no damn sense. And I remember Eve there that night. How scared she was. I remember her white dress and thinking that for once, we were all dressed like her, and she didn't stand out. I remember her crying backstage and being scared to death to go out, and not singing the entire time but just freezing up. I'd bet my soul that all that happened. The final picture was also useless. Just me and Brian Reed in a kickball game we played on the last day of school. Brian Reed was trying to peg me out, and I'm running like a madman for first base. I saved that picture of the Christmas concert onto my phone. It was just the proof I needed to show Asher. The next day, when I ran into Asher, I showed him the picture. To my surprise, this actually affected him. He seemed nervous when he started to consider how weird the picture looked. He told me that if I had mentioned Eve now, after he'd seen the picture, he would have just thought it was a coincidence. But since I mentioned Eve before either of us had seen it, it made it a lot stranger. He wasn't ready to believe in the Mandela effect. Not like I was. but he was curious enough to ask his mother if she had our class picture. She did. Both of us waited anxiously for her to send it. I couldn't remember anything about the picture. Still, I wanted to see if there was a strange placement of students, like the Christmas concert, and so did Asher. When he got the message, both of us were shaking with anxiousness. The moment I saw it, I gasped. "I remember!" I jumped. "The bee sting!" "Huh?" Asher flinched, startled by my screaming. "Asher!" I grabbed him. "See how we're standing like that? It was because of Eve." Miss Davis stood in the middle of us, 7 of us on her left, and 7 of us on her right. Those on her left were turned slightly to face her, thus the left sides of their faces were showing and the right sides were blocked, and those on her right were turned leftward, so their right was facing the photographer. What stood out was the ample negative space in the picture. When groups pose in this fashion, it's a way to shrink the size of the group. Usually the cameraman has trouble fitting all the people into the shot, and thus they form this way so that they can all scrunch up and fit, but still look natural. But in this picture, it's easy to see that we had more than enough room to stand correctly and still fit. That wasn't the reason we stood that way. "Asher!" I felt as if I'd struck gold. "We're all posed like that because Eve got stung by a bee. Dude, tell me you remember. We were going in to take the picture, and she got stung right underneath her right eye. Her face got all swollen, and she was crying because she didn't want to look like that in the picture. So the photographer said to pose like this, and Eve could turn the left side of her face to the camera." "Dude," Asher scratched his head. "We just posed like this so we could save room." "No, we didn't. There's no reason to do that. There's so much room on the left and right side. It's unnatural. We wouldn't have just done it for that reason." "I don't remember anything like that happening, man. Honestly, this is starting to weird me out. I just think we should forget about it." "I can't forget about it," I replied. "She was real. I can't believe nobody can remember her." There was only one option left for me to do. I had to have a reunion with them. If we all met up and others of us remembered Eve, I'd know I wasn't crazy. Most of us hadn't spoken in years. Still, I had Erin as my friend on Facebook. She talked all the time about having a reunion now that we were all in our 20s, and I knew if I mentioned it, she'd ruthlessly try to put it together. I contacted her that night, and she was completely on board. All of us were about to be free from college for winter break, and I suggested we meet back in Tawas City. I was going down there anyway to see my family for Christmas. My mom had long suggested I throw a reunion at the house. She said she'd be honored to host and cater it. When I told Erin about it, she couldn't be more compliant. She assured me she'd contact the others. "All 15, she said. My heart raced. I asked, "All 15?
Yeah, all 15.
She responded.
Us and Miss Davis.
At that moment, I felt another sense of dread. Erin always tried to keep the group together. Her forgetting Eve meant something was seriously wrong. When December 18th arrived, I was shocked to pull into my old driveway. I hadn't been there in years. Usually on Christmas, they came down to Tallahassee to visit me. It wasn't anything against them, I just hated Tawas City. Around Christmas time, it was freezing cold, and most of its residents went south for winter if they could afford it. It was a ghost town, and a frigid one at that. My parents had picked me up from the airport and driven me here. The entire way, I reminisced. As we passed through the frozen-over cornfields, under the bleak white sky, I felt like I'd been here yesterday. Nothing was different. It was all completely recognizable. Perhaps the only difference was some old buildings looked even older, even more decrepit and abandoned. Throughout the drive, and especially when I got back to my house before anyone else arrived, really all I could think about was Eve. I felt closer to her in this ominous, forgotten town. Back, entrenched in the snow, something I hadn't felt in years, I sensed that she was in arm's reach of me. I knew that if I were to ever find closure, it'd be at this reunion. If just one person remembered her, then I wasn't crazy. Then the Mandela effect was real, and Eve was real, and Asher was wrong. God, I prayed for that closure. At 4 o'clock, all of us that could make it arrived. Miss Davis was unfortunately busy with her family, as her father was dying and they didn't know how much time he had left. And Norman was completely untraceable. The last of us to hear from him was Brian Reed, who remembered Norman getting into trouble sometime around 8th grade and going to juvenile detention. After that, he pretty much vanished. Not like Eve, though. He was still in the pictures. They still remembered his name. When the other 12 showed up at the house, I forgot about Eve for just a moment. Seeing Erin again was awesome. She was as beautiful and energetic as always. Her long brown hair now styled maturely, and her vibrant green eyes now only wiser. Tyler Mahoney was also just as handsome as he'd always been. The stud was still dressed to kill, even in the freezing weather. Brian Reed had joined the Navy and was on Liberty. He was even bigger now than he was then, and was engaged to his girlfriend since high school. Grayson, on the other hand, was not favored by time. She looked older than she was, remained far shorter than most of us. Her face was covered with acne. Still, she was a lot more outgoing than any of us could remember. Zach looked a lot like how I remembered. Tan, skinny. The only difference was now he had a mustache. He'd worked at Home Depot ever since high school and was still living with his parents that moved to Minnesota. Amy was unrecognizable. She had bright blue hair now, which wasn't necessarily a surprise considering how rebellious she was growing up, but the piercings were unprecedented. Elizabeth was much like she always was, generally quiet and sweet, with her alluring amber eyes that nobody could forget. Dylan didn't look the way any of us thought he would. He was now ravishing, tall, and wore rich stubble along his grand face. He still wore glasses, and I'm glad. Contacts on Dylan would have just been staggering. He'd had a higher GPA than even Aaron, and all of us were proud of him. George and Jordan both looked a lot different now, and was wiry and stout. Jordan, on the other hand, was more reserved, amusingly taller than his twin brother George. Jordan's hair was neat and short. George's hair was a thick mess of black curls. They didn't even speak the same anymore. George spoke profanely, and Jordan seemed to be a stranger to vulgarities. It was intriguing to see them so different. Taz was just as goofy as ever. To our surprise, he'd been going to college and was working on a business degree, but when he talked about something he was passionate about, you couldn't understand a word of what he was saying. The moment he stepped inside, he blabbered on and on and on, and all we could do was laugh. He was just as crazy as ever. Asher and I were generally believed to look the same. Asher's hair was still red, mine still brown. His eyes were still green, mine blue. His face was still freckly, mine smooth. He was still a prankster, and I was still quiet most of the time. The only difference was both of us were more in shape since we started running together. But the complacent joy of seeing all of my friends again only distracted me for a short while. Before long, my thoughts were back on Eve. I waited for her to come in the door, but I knew she never would. I waited for somebody to mention her, but I knew it would never happen. With Miss Davis and Norman accounted for, everyone was here. It disheartened me, to say the least. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe I read too much about the Mandela effect, and the bee sting thing was just a power of suggestion. And that Christmas concert picture was just weird. Maybe I dreamed of Eve once, or she was in my preschool, and I just screwed it all up in my head. There was no way to be sure. After dinner, we all went into the living room and talked. I tried to enjoy myself, but something felt wrong. Eve should have been there. It bothered me so much that no one had asked about her, and I knew I had to bring her up. But I didn't want to look crazy. Asher had asked me not to mention her, and I didn't want to annoy him. I also wasn't prepared to hear them tell me they remembered her. What would I do then? I wouldn't be delusional, but then what? The horror of trying to accept what became of her. What would be close to impossible. I wanted so badly to hear from someone that she was real, but I didn't know how I'd ever forget her if I had to really imagine the universe forgetting her. Bumping shoulders with some alternate dimension and ripping her from the snowstorms of Tawas City to some other place light years away. Most of it looking the same, with the exception of a few things that were just eerily different. I wanted to stay quiet. I wanted to just forget about her, but I knew that wasn't an option. I didn't know what was more disturbing to me, the Mandela effect happening so close to home in my life, or me being this delusional. Either way, I had to know. I could hold it in no longer. Hey guys, I spoke up nervously. I need to ask you all a question. Asher looked disappointed. What's up, Sean? Brian Reed asked. Look, this might sound, weird, but where's Eve? Yeah, I was thinking that this whole time. Tyler Mahoney spoke up, and my heart stopped. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't crazy. Somebody else remembered her, and no one else did. There was confused silence devouring the room now. Asher looked as if he'd seen a ghost. I myself was horrified and at the same time overwhelmed with relief.
Eve?
Aaron asked.
Eve who?
I don't remember her last name, Tyler replied. It was quiet, short, blonde chick, wore a dress all the time. Holy shit, Asher muttered, bewildered. Holy shit.
Am I missing something?
Amy asked. There was a girl named Eve in our first grade class, I spoke up. But nobody remembers her. At least, I thought nobody did. I chuckled nervously. But Tyler, you do, man. I thought I'd lost my fucking mind. She's not in any of the pictures, not a damn one. There's no sign of her ever existing except for my memories. I swear to God, I thought I'd gone off the deep end, but Tyler, you remember her. That brings me so much closure. There was no Eve, Dylan responded. I don't recall an Eve. I remember each of you distinctly. I can't imagine how I would have forgotten one of you completely, and yet vividly remembered the rest of you. I agree, Jordan chimed in. There were 4 girls. I remember that easily. There wasn't a 5th. Yeah, there was, Tyler replied, which gave me so much peace. I had a crush on her, remember? Not to sound like a douchebag, but all you girls liked me. He faced them, and none could deny it. But then I had a crush on Eve, and... The note! I burst into uproarious laughter, recalling it instantly. Yeah! Tyler laughed. The room was silent. I liked Eve, Tyler chuckled. Nobody knew why I liked her because she was all silent and standoffish, but I just fell for her, so I wrote this super corny, embarrassing note, and I went to hand it to her. And you got caught, I finished, just wanting to see it all line up again. And Miss Davis confiscated it, and everybody wanted to know what it said because when she read it, she started laughing her head off. Yeah, and it was the most embarrassing day of my life. He grinned. You guys don't remember? Most of them looked uncomfortable.
I don't remember an Eve.
Elizabeth spoke with certainty.
Never do I remember that name. I don't remember the day you're talking about. And we all certainly did used to snicker about you.
She smiled, but looked troubled.
All of us girls. I think we'd remember that.
It happened. Tyler shrugged. How would Sean and I remember the same thing, exactly the same thing, and it not really happen? And how would everyone remember the thinker's fingers balled into a confident fist, when they were in fact flaccidly poking his chest? And how would everyone remember King Tutankhamun's burial mask with its lone snake as its crowning feature, when all along there was a lucid, brightly constructed bird immediately beside it? And how would everyone remember Nelson Mandela's untimely fate in a downtrodden South African prison, resulting in monstrous civil unrest? Vividly recorded footage of his ubiquitously aired funeral and the tear-jerking lamentation delivered by his widow in his passing, when all of it never fucking happened. It's because something disturbing and unthinkable occurred. Something that none of us will ever explain happened, emasculating the thinker's resolute stoicism to a pose of deep uncertainty, producing the unnatural bird like a blackhead on King Tut's burial mask, and turning Nelson Mandela into a zombie who lived unnoticed until he passed away again in 2013, leaving those of us remembering differently absolutely baffled.
Well, that's just really weird.
Aaron's words were the catharsis the room looked for. No matter what Eve's existence, or lack thereof, meant, none could disagree that it was, in fact, just really weird. We changed the subject afterward, and most of us seemed to move on rather quickly from the enigma. But I didn't. It bothered me the entire time, gnawing at me. I wanted to sit and talk with Tyler about Eve all night. I wanted to hear all the stories about her that he remembered. I was dying to ask him if he recalled the bee sting story, but it just never came up. I couldn't ask it. I didn't want to visit it anymore. It did something to me that I can't explain. To imagine that little girl being stung in the eye, crying before picture day in our snowy, empty town. The memory alone was enough to make me tremble. That poor little girl, showing the left side of her chubby face to the camera. Where was she now? Why couldn't anyone remember? I did my best to just forget. But Eve was stuck in my head. I knew I'd never forget about her. The Mandela effect was real. She really did exist once, and now she didn't. What the hell happened to her then? I mean, really, it was just too terrifying to think about, and I couldn't forget it, no matter how desperately I tried. Asher seemed to be in my boat. Most of them stayed the night at my house, since there wasn't a motel in the entire town, and the majority of our parents had moved. The next day, everyone was out of town except me, having flown out back to the land of the living. Only I stayed behind in the snow-scoured wasteland of Tawas City, Michigan. Only I remained in this hotspot of the universe, this place where two realities collided. I didn't receive the closure I'd wanted from the reunion. We all exchanged numbers and were staying in touch now, which was great, but more than anything, I was constantly bombarded by thoughts of Eve. I just wanted something to make sense. I stayed awake late at night, thinking about her voice that I could so simply recall, reading to us, "There is a big bird on your head," and Max's words. I remembered her so scared at social events and huddling through the snow, still wearing a dress, though adorned with mittens and a scarf, toward her loving mother, where they'd hug outside her fancy black car. I remembered Eve's crying when the bee stung her eye. That memory for some reason bothered me more than the others. It just affected me. Something about it really cut deep. She was so innocent, and I felt so bad for her, and now she wasn't the victim of a simple bee sting, but of some horrible cosmic event leaving her non-existent. My parents wanted me to stick around until Christmas, but the thought of that killed me. I didn't want to stay in this wasteland for a week. I hated it, and now I was scared to death here. Would I get ripped from reality into the cosmos? It happened here once already. This mystery just consumed the town to me, drenching it and leaving me constantly reminded of Eve, the girl that stopped existing. Days passed, and all I did was sit in the living room and watch TV. I enjoyed seeing my parents when they were around, but both worked, and this meant I spent a lot of time alone at the house, which I abhorred. Eventually, I dug through my old closet to find something that might be from first grade. I didn't find anything. I did, however, hold in my hand the picture that Eve was yanked from, the one where she should be between Elizabeth and Amy, but she isn't. She's not there, and there's just that unnatural space between them. Bastard universe. It's so smug, so omnipotent, that it can leave clues as gaping as this, and yet still there's just no way to prove that she's real. But then, on Christmas Eve, it happened. I got a text from Tyler. "Sean, I read up on the Mandela effect. That shit's got me fucked up. I think this is what happened, but I remember something now, and this might really prove Eve existed for sure. The note I wrote her, you stole it. You took it off Miss Davis's desk and gave it back to me, but then I told you to keep it and throw it away. You told me later on that you never threw it away, but took it home and showed your parents and laughed your ass off every time you read it. Where is it? If you still have it, it'll be proof." Holy shit. I gasped when I read the text. Holy shit, you're completely right, Tyler. I'm gonna have to find that note. I swear to God, I will, and when I do, I'll send you pictures. Then we can prove she's real for sure. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Wouldn't the note not exist now too? Well, no. See, when the Mandela effect occurs, only things directly related to what was changed are altered. That's why the people posing in front of the thinker are still posing wrong. That's why the cartoons in which King Tut's mask has one snake on it and no bird still look like that. The only thing changed is the real deal, so the actual pictures of Eve, they're gone, but she's pulled from them, and there's not a trace of her remaining. But the note, if I found it, it would be just the proof I needed. It would mention her by name. My dad told me that I could feel free to check the storage unit for the note. Apparently, there he'd placed a lot of crap I didn't clean in my closet growing up, and if it was anywhere, it'd be there. I even faintly remember stealing it now, like the rotten kid I was, and reading it from time to time for a good laugh. Some part of me wanted to wait until my dad got off work to check the storage unit with him, but I knew, somehow, that I'd never find the note if he was there. I felt like I had to do it alone. I drove there through the snow on a day just as bleak and silent as any other in Tawas. I passed the lonely cornfields, the ominous tower-like silos, the seemingly empty fish shops, in the frozen harbor. It was all just how it always was. When I got to the storage unit, I was strangely horrified. I felt like I was about to walk into a haunted house. As a kid, the storage unit always scared me. In all my life, I know as a fact, I've never seen another soul in that building other than my father. It was always dark and empty, and now, without him by my side searching for this letter about a ghost, I was mortified. But I continued on. I entered the frigid, voluminous metal halls, journeying through them and turning on the lights as I stepped into each corridor. Finally, I arrived at our unit. I dreaded lifting the door. It made a frighteningly loud creak. It unsettled me to hear it, even though I was the one making it. I lifted the door as quietly as possible, which wasn't quiet at all, then began my hunt. I looked for over an hour. I could barely reach the boxes in the back, and each one was filled to the brim with junk, usually sporting a silverfish or two. But then I found it. My baseball cards. These were from first grade. They were in a plastic container, barely visible under the pile of junk in which it resided, but I grabbed the box, sliding it out of its tomb and into my arms. I opened the container. Inside were the baseball cards. The Berenstain Bears book. It's fucking creepy. And spelled with an A, of course. Some doodles and old notebooks. And a folded up letter. I recognized it instantly. I held it in my hands. Now in the lonely, cold, silent, eerie storage unit, I caressed the piece of evidence the universe forgot. I slid open the old paper, hardly able to breathe as I searched for the name. I unfolded it. Dear Eve. That was all I had to read. Dear Eve. Dear Eve. Dear Eve. I folded it up and slid it into my pocket. I took a long, deep breath, leaning against a pile of dusty boxes. Eve was real. The girl that stopped existing was really here once in this graveyard of a town, and I wasn't crazy. And somehow, some way, two universes collided, and Eve was ripped into oblivion by the silver fingers of the cosmos, vacuumed from existence without a single trace, except my memories, Tyler's memories, and the note in my hand. What happened to her? Where was she now? Was she alive? Where was that sweet, quiet, sobbing girl? And would I ever know? Probably not. She's in a place where Curious George has a tale, and where children grew up reading the Berenstain Bears. She was taught that Nelson Mandela died in a South African prison, and when she pretends to be a thinker, she isn't posing wrong. I hope. Or maybe she is nothing now. Maybe the universe made a tragic mistake, and that harmless girl will never trudge into her mother's loving arms again, but instead spend eternity scared to death, trapped in the swirling gray snow. I have no idea, but as I sat there, all I could do was imagine the ghost of her sitting there with me. I felt so close to her in that place that time forgot, in that meaningless metal room, trapped in a town in which the universe made a mistake. When I finally flew back to Tallahassee, I couldn't be more relieved. I vowed that I would never return to Tawas City, Michigan, no matter what the reason. As far as I was concerned, it was better left behind, like Eve was. But like usual, I just couldn't escape her. I texted pictures of the note to Asher and Tyler. Both were equally as messed up. We all just tried to put it behind us, though. And then Miss Davis updated her Facebook.
I'm sorry I couldn't make it to the reunion.
she posted.
But I just wanted to say that I'll make the next one for sure. To my favorite class ever.
She also published a picture, a drawing from Elizabeth. It was a drawing of the class, and it was clearly drawn by a child. Amateurish, simple, messy, in colored pencil. But simple as it was, there was nothing normal about it. It was a drawing of 10 little boys, and a drawing of 5 little girls. A drawing of a short blonde girl with brown eyes, in what could only be distinguished as a dress. I don't know how anyone else reacted to that, but I know I'll never unsee that image. Even now, all these years later, sometimes she comes to mind. I can't help it. I've seen horrible and unexplainable things in my life. 2 towers destroyed by hijacked planes for no reason at all other than sheer hatred, leaving thousands dead. A preschool invaded by an active shooter that employed military tactics, killing little children, and entirely unprovoked by anything. But none of it affects me more than Eve, the girl the universe forgot.